Hello everyone, Chris Peterson here, bringing you another commentary slash analysis on one of my 2012 tournament games. I realized the other day that I actually skipped over round 5 from the May 2012 DCC Tuesday tournament. So I figured I would go ahead and do analysis on that. It was a pretty good game. My opponent is Kevin Seidler, who is an expert from the Denver area. I've known Kevin for quite some time. We have become, fairly good friends. He helps me out. He helped me out at the DCC by entering games into the computer and giving me the PGN. And these games eventually ended up on the DCC website. But yes, I'm pretty sure most of those games are already up on the website. It's denverchess.com if you want to check it out, make an account, whatever. Now Kevin is, he's tall and he's pretty lanky, and he has an affinity for hats and sunglasses. It's pretty rare to see him without a baseball cap on. I probably wouldn't recognize him without one. But he has an interesting style of chess. He plays what is typically considered positional slash defensive openings. But plays them really dynamically and aggressively, and it can be really difficult to get a good position against him out of the opening. So here's the game. Kevin is white, and I am black. And it started out e4, c5, knight c3, knight c6, f4, and this is called the Sicilian Grand Prix, the Grand Prix attack out of the Sicilian. E6, knight f3. Now, my new and improved move order against this opening is to play a6, and the main idea is to deter the development of the light-squared bishop. Usually it would come out to c4, and then to play for moves like f5, for example, and just put massive pressure on the a2, g8 diagonal after the black king is castled. But with this a6 move in, I'm basically threatening to play b5 if the bishop comes out to c4, and I would just win tempos right out of the opening. So the development of the bishop to the queen side looks rather dismal. And here white usually opts to switch the game into a closed Sicilian or a King's Indian attack. So one potential move might be to play d3, with the idea of going g3 and bishop g2. Another possibility is to play a4 to still try to develop the bishop to c4. This one's not nearly as popular as some of the other choices, and it's just not as active, I guess. Another good option is for them to play d4, and it would transpose into some weird kind of open Sicilian with f4 played, so I'm not sure exactly how that would turn out. It would probably be a lot like a Najdorf in this position, although the bishop would usually be on g5 in some of the main lines. The dark-squared bishop, I mean, and since it can't get there anymore because this pawn here is blocking it. So, and recently I just played a game where someone played after a6, they played bishop to e2, and I found this fairly simple to play against because just natural moves gives black a fairly decent position out of the opening. However, I played knight to f6 in this game, and Kevin followed in standard Grand Prix style with bishop b5. And Kevin and I have played several blitz games, a ton of blitz games in this exact position. And somehow with the distractions of trying to run the tournament and playing, I completely botched this position up, though. Yeah, I guess I didn't mention in any of the previous videos, but I was actually managing this tournament while I was playing in it, and it gets kind of hectic with people asking questions and things like that. But that's no excuse, really. So I played knight d4. I think this is all fairly mainline stuff. Again, I'm terrible with opening theory and stuff, so if my opening knowledge is lacking, that's probably why. So now bishop d3, and typically, for example in blitz, I would almost always play d5 here. It's the natural equalizing move in most Sicilian positions, and here I can just get it in without much cost at all. But for some reason I thought castling sooner would be better, so I tried playing bishop to e7, and this just allows white to totally screw up my pawns with e5. And now my knight on f6 has like nowhere to go, basically. I could try knight to h5, but after knight d4, c takes d4, queen h5, dc3, dc3. White is up a pawn and he has a better position, so black is doing very poorly. There's just a lack of control over the center right now for black, so that's why he's doing kind of bad. Another option might be to play knight g8, try to hold on to the pawn that way. But after knight d4, cd4, knight b5, knight h6, knight takes d4, d6. Black is doing somewhat better here. He's still down a pawn, so eventually it would come back and bite it. So instead, let's see. Another option might be to just take on f3. Queen takes f3, and now knight g8, and this allows black to maintain material equality. But black has a serious lack of development, and that's going to be a real nightmare for black. I mean, where is he supposed to castle? Eventually white's going to play b3, bishop b2, and castles kingside. And no matter where black goes, his king's going to be either exposed if he goes queenside, or exposed very quickly after f5 on the king side. And he can't stay in the center for too long because the rooks are going to come to f1 and e1. And then after f5, everything's blowing open, and black's going to be in a lot of trouble. So instead, I just let me fix this really quick. So instead, I just opted to go into having tripled pawns, which is definitely not ideal. So one important thing to note here is that if I play knight takes f3, queen takes f3, pawn takes knight, then queen takes d5, I lose the pawn right away, and I've actually lost tempos in this, rather than the way that I played it, which is just to take the knight back right away. And yes, I end up with these triple d pawns, and yes, it's horrific, but I've actually saved a tempo because now the queen has to use a move to develop to f3 rather than develop after I've captured something. And that's something that I've actually tried to describe to people before, is kind of the sense that you don't want to be the first one to capture something. Because if I do capture here, yes, I don't get the triple pawns, I grant that. But it's basically forfeiting one of my tempo to allow white to develop. So it's kind of a trade-off. Have the triple pawns or allow white to get extra development. I opted to just have the triple pawns and deal with it. So e takes d5, knight takes knight, c takes d4, and now queen f3. And now this extra tempo allows me to at least get a jump start on what's happening in the position. I played d6. There's no adequate way to defend all the d-pawns. I could try queen a5, but white's going to simply castle, play b3, bishop b2, and I'm going to drive myself nuts trying to hold on to these tripled pawns. So instead, I just gave it up right away and tried to go for a more open position where my bishops can do something, rather than just trying to relegate my queen or one of my bishops to defending the pawns. So queen takes d5, d takes e5, and now that the pawns aren't doubled or tripled, the endgame wouldn't be so hopeless here if white decided to trade queens with queen takes d8. I mean, just as an example, let's say queen takes d8, bishop takes d8. Sorry, I'm kind of going off the Fritz analysis here because I haven't really looked at it too much. F takes e5, bishop c7, and now this pawn here is stranded. He has no one that can get to him right away, so this pawn is going to become a major hindrance to white. So castles, and then I believe I can just take this pawn because I have f6 defending the bishop if he pins it. And now I'm no longer down a pawn, which is excellent for me. I still have an isolated d pawn, so that's no good. But material's equal, so I've definitely recovered some of my disadvantage. So d takes e5, queen takes e5, and now I just simply castled. I can't leave myself pinned up too long. Actually, castling's like the only move here. So castles, and now bishop f6, and bishop f6 is nice because it defends my d pawn, which will free up my queen to move about the board. And it also gains a tempo on the queen, which is nice. And then I can also fianchetto my dark squared bishop, which will one, blunt the attack on the light squares. Well, let me make that a red arrow for danger. So it blunts the pressure on the light squares around my king, and it also puts my bishop on a better square via g7, which will also challenge his bishop when he decides to go bishop to b2. So bishop f6 is a fairly decent move here. So queen e4. Basically winning the tempo back, but it's a tempo that I was planning on doing anyway, so g6, only move in this position in this case. And now we played queen f3, which it's a good move, but another option might be to play f5, and then after rook e8, queen f3. And this is good because it hampers the development of my light squared bishop. I can no longer come to e6. I'll have to develop via d7. And then it also helps further white's attack on the king side. And in fact, he's already threatening to play pawn takes g6, which kind of forces me to play g5 here. I could screw up my pawn structure more by playing bishop takes f5 as another defensive idea. Or g takes f5, but I think g5 seems like the more appropriate action to try to make the game more complicated. And the reason why I would want to make the game more complicated is because when you're losing or you have a worse position, the more complicated it gets, the muddier the winning plan is for your opponent. So I noticed a lot of people tend to simplify when they're losing. For example, they're down a pawn, so they decide to simplify down into like a bishop ending or a knight ending. A rook ending wouldn't be so terrible, but when you're down material, it's not good to trade. It's a basic. I mean, it's a very basic. I guess rule would be a good way to say it. But when you're down material, don't trade because you want it to be more complicated. Okay, so he decided to go queen f3 and now bishop e6, b3. So white's plan is fairly simple. He just wants to complete his development, put his rooks on. So he wants to go bishop b2 and then put his rooks on e1 and f1, and all his pieces are perfectly placed. He just has to figure out a way to break through, and black's going to be in big trouble. So bishop d5, gaining another tempo on the queen, and suddenly my bishops are actually pretty powerful. They're both on the long diagonal, so the white bishop is actually raking all the way across his king, like this. And yeah, I mean, I don't think black's position is that bad. Yes, he is down a pawn, but I don't know. It doesn't seem so bad to me, is all. So queen g4, and now I played h5, and the thing is I have lots of options. I could go queen a5, I could go bishop g7, queen c7, and Fritz thinks they're all fairly equal. Queen a5 being slightly better, but I don't know, h5 is nice because it gains a tempo. I'm just trying to kick around this queen and gain as much development advantage as I can. Right now, I don't. It's about equal development-wise. One more move and his rooks will be connected, and one more move for me and my rooks will be connected. So it's about equal development-wise. I mean, the only thing, if black had another pawn, say on c5, this position would be dead equal. Actually, black might be slightly better because of his better placed bishops, but it would be pretty much dead equal. So every little advantage I can try to eke out of the position will help me get back to that equality. Alright, so queen h3, and now I played queen c8, and I thought the trading of the queens would be idyllic for me here. However, if I had seen what Kevin played, I might have opted for something a little more active. Perhaps better is queen a5. So the main idea is to prevent this bishop from developing, because now I've got pressure on this d2 square. And so it slows down white a little bit, but not for too long. And in fact, white might just end up sacrificing that pawn to go ahead and finish his development and continue with his attack. And even f5 here would be really strong. So now I would probably have to play g5 to blunt his light square, the light square diagonal. And then queen takes h5, king g7, queen g4, rook h8, and it's still not a great position for black, but black has a lot of play, and it's a fairly simple position to play for black. Black has one main plan. He wants to go bishop to e5 to get his bishops on the ideal squares, so that they're raking the white king. But that's going to be difficult with white playing bishop to b2, putting pressure on d4. Yeah, that's all there really is to say about this position. I mean, black's down 2 pawns, but he's got really active pieces. So, I mean, it all comes down to how well can white defend, and how accurate black can be with his moves, basically. So after queen c8, Kevin came up with a very strong response. He played f5, preventing the queen trade, and also furthering his attack a little bit. And now I played king g7, and my main defensive play is to go g5, and the whole point is to blunt white's bishops, because the dark square bishop will be blocked by d4, and the light square bishop will be blocked by the pawn on f5. But if I want to play g5 without dropping the h-pawn, I need to have my queen on a better square. For example, if my queen is on c7 pressuring h3, the h5 pawn is now immune from capture because of rook h8 helping, putting one more attacker on h2, and suddenly black is the one with the strong attack. So after white played bishop to b2, I still have this pin along this diagonal, but I played queen c7, which is a huge mistake because it relinquishes that pin on that pawn, and it walks right into the path of the oncoming attack. So maybe a little better to hold on is queen d7 or bishop c6. But white still has a comfortable advantage against most of the defensive ideas. So queen c7. So then rook f2, and Kevin missed his big attacking chance here. He should have played this sacrifice. Pawn takes g6, pawn takes g6, rook f6, rook f6, bishop d4, and now white's bishops are overwhelming. He's got pressure. He's got pressure everywhere. His rook's going to be coming over to f1, and everything's going to be falling apart for black fairly quickly. But with that f2 move, with the rook f2 move, it gives me the one tempo that I needed to defend my king. So I played g5. And now, like I mentioned, the bishop b2 and the bishop d3 are both blocked in by the pawns on d4 and f5 respectively. And, I mean, there isn't really much danger against black's king anymore. And, of course, that h5 pawn is immune from capture because of rook h8 hitting the h2 pawn. So a slight hesitation and mistake there by Kevin, but he still has a strong advantage here. He's still up a pawn, so it's definitely not a hopeless position by any means. He's still totally winning. So now he plays rook e1, just getting his rooks onto those amazing files. He's going to swing his f1 rook over to, his f2 rook to e2, so that way he's completely controlling that e file. So I have to make sure I prevent him from having total dominance of the only open file. So I go rook f to e8, now rook fe2, rook e2, rook e2, and now queen f4. I don't necessarily need to contest the e file because I have a half-open c file I can work with for my rook. So a move like queen d7, not really going to be doing anything, or maybe queen c6, but also still, I think better is queen f4 because it puts the queen on a really active square, and it kind of questions white. You know, what are your pieces doing? Both your bishops are kind of blocked out. Your queen is on an awkward square since it can't capture h5, and now your rook is on e2. Yes, it has the e file, but I guess that's his best placed piece right now. Is probably the e2 rook, although maybe it's a little better on e1 or yeah, I don't think it can be anywhere else, e1 or e2. So queen f4 is kind of nice because it puts it on a really aggressive square. And now Kevin played queen g3, and it's kind of important to note here that the h5 pawn is technically hanging because of g3. However, after just rook h5, pawn takes queen, this position is equal. It's highly irregular. Black has doubled f pawns, but there's a certain lack of mobility in white's pieces. So black should have a fairly easy time holding on to this position. All he has to do is cover the e file, and that's about it. I mean, it's difficult for both sides to make progress, so it's fairly easy to say that this position could peter out to a draw. So this would have been a good position for me to have, since I went from being losing, basically, because I'm down a pawn, to equal again. And I am still down a pawn here, yes, but I mean, it's not much of a deficit really at this point because of the just the activity of black's pieces. I mean, the rook's going to be coming to g5, and it's just getting all kinds of nasty for white. So queen f4. Now Kevin played queen g3, and you know, I was comfortable going into an ending here, so I just played queen g3, hg3, and now rook c8. And The idea behind rook c8 was to, yes, take over the half-open c-file, but also to prevent the trade of the light-squared bishops. White was threatening to go bishop to e4, basically forcing the trade of bishops. The bishop has nowhere else to go. And with rook c8, if he goes bishop e4 now, simply bishop takes, rook c2, and now I'm going to be gobbling a bunch of pawns on the second rank. So that should be fairly winning for me, although it could still be a draw if it turns into some kind of rook ending, but I'd be fairly confident in this position. At least I know I couldn't lose the position because White's pawns would be so weak and my rook is so active. So Kevin played king to f2. So at this point, I wasn't sure what Kevin's plan was. It was difficult for me to look at his position and come up with a clear plan. He can't trade off the light square bishops. His dark square bishop doesn't have a very good home. His rook is ideally placed, but it too isn't really doing anything. And meanwhile, I had a fairly simple plan of trying to get my king into attacking the weakened g and f pawns. So I played g4. And the main idea behind this move is to restrict the white king, just in case the light square bishops get traded off. And it also has the added benefit of removing the f pawn of his friend on the g file. So now this f pawn is just kind of stranded out here in the middle of nowhere, and my king will be able to march up and capture it eventually. Maybe. So now Kevin played king e1, and after king e1 it became fairly obvious what White's plan is. He wants to trade off the light square bishops by defending c2 with his king. And yeah, I mean that's as simple as a plan can get. So I wasn't too concerned about that because I could still play my plan. His plan wasn't really interfering. So I played king h6, and I'm basically jockeying for position, jockeying for an entry point into the weakened pawns. If the light square bishops are traded, the f5 pawn will be undefended, for example. And then I can also push h4, which will allow my king to penetrate against the double g pawns. So now Kevin played king d1, continuing with his plan. I played king g5, continuing with mine. And now Kevin played c4, and this move kind of surprised me. I wasn't really watching for it. But it is a pretty logical move because my pawn on d4 is really restrictive to White's position, so naturally he would want me to trade it off with en passant. And if I retreated my bishop to, say, c6, maybe he can, I don't know, somehow get into the position a little better with bishop a3 or something like that. So c4 kind of makes sense. I think it was... I guess it's one of the top choices, top 5, but they're all kind of fairly similar. I guess best is to just go bishop a3 and try to make something happen with the bishop. But so after c4, d takes c3, d takes c3. And now looking at the position again, I think the c3 pawn is capturable. It was scary to put my bishop in a pin, so I avoided it. But if I played bishop takes c3, rook c2, bishop b2, rook c8, bishop g2, bishop takes g2, now my two bishops are going to be extremely difficult for White to handle. Simply because they have really strong outposts and they're defending all my weak pawns. So eventually it might end up looking like my pawn is going to be on f6, my dark square bishop on e5, and my light square bishop on f3. And it would be a very difficult position for White to crack. And meanwhile, I have pass pawn potential with h4, so that's going to be something he has to watch out for. Not to mention my bishop on e5 is going to be pressuring the g3 pawn, which will be really difficult to defend. So this position would be a complete nightmare for white, but still probably holdable, but it would be pretty difficult. So instead, I opted to play h4, and this is that entry point that I was talking about earlier. So after bishop c1 check, king h5, c4, bishop c6. Kevin made a mistake here. He actually played bishop to f4. He should probably just allow my king to come in with pawn takes pawn, king takes. And then I'm not sure, maybe he can play bishop f4 now to prevent my king from coming to g3. And this position is still awkward. I mean, white probably has a slight advantage because he's still up a pawn, but black has definitely equalized the position quite a bit. But instead, he played bishop f4 right away, thinking that I would just capture on g3. And I mentioned this in one of my previous videos. I think it was a video against Avinaya Subadai, or Subadi, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. But I think it's one of the hardest things to see when playing is really strong pawn pushes, especially if there is tension between moving a pawn. Between the moving pawn and another pawn. So, for example, these two pawns here could capture each other, and our minds kind of automatically assume that they can and will capture each other. But in this case, it's much stronger to just bypass that capture altogether and play h3, because it's basically giving myself a passed pawn, and that's going to be very difficult for white to deal with now, because yes, it's just a rook pawn against bishops, but there's also white pawns kind of in the way blocking things, so that makes it more difficult. So Kevin played the only move, g takes h3, and now I played bishop f3, kind of a nice little in-between move. Basically, it's just putting the rook into a pin so that if he plays pawn takes g4 now, I'll play king takes, and then eventually I'll be able to put more pressure on the rook if he doesn't break the pin. And I'll be able to win an exchange, and that'll be an easier position for me to draw. So king c2. Yeah, king c2 is a pretty bad mistake. I think he was assuming that I would get greedy and try to take the bishop, try to take the rook on e2, but that would actually be a pretty big mistake, because after bishop takes e2, white is threatening checkmate, which is pretty difficult to defend, actually. I actually have to go bishop g5, and now bishop takes g4 check, king h6. The checkmate, if you don't see it, is just to capture bishop g4, or even pawn takes g4 is going to be a checkmate, so I have to watch out for that. Bishop g5, bishop takes g4 check, king h6, and now bishop d6. And now you can see that white's bishops are actually going to be really difficult to deal with, because moves like pawn c5, maybe getting this bishop out of the way, and then just start rolling these pawns forward, and yeah, black's going to be in a world of hurt. So it's important not to get greedy, because a lot of times if your opponent's just giving you things, it's for a good reason. Sometimes it's just a blunder, but you gotta look at these things. You can't just assume that they blundered. So instead I played g takes h3, and suddenly, after 29 moves of torture, I finally have the advantage. And that advantage entirely lies with that passed h-pawn. So Kevin played rook h2, and I played king g4. It would be a mistake to play bishop g2 because of the looming checkmate with bishop e2. It would be nice to defend the pawn with the bishop, but I have to keep track of my king and make sure I'm not getting checkmated in the process. Another option is to go bishop g4, but that's kind of retreating a little bit, and it really restricts my ability to push forward that h-pawn. So king g4 is the right way to continue. And now Kevin played bishop f1, pressuring that h-pawn, and also preventing bishop g2 because of bishop takes, pawn takes, rook takes. So I played rook h8, the only way to maintain the passed pawn. Also, rooks belong behind passed pawns. And now Kevin played b4. There isn't really a whole lot that white can do about this. He could blunt my main threat of bishop d4 with king d3. So for example, I'm trying to go bishop d4 to bishop g1 so that I can start pushing that h-pawn. And if he goes king d3, he'll be covering the d4 square. But after b4, it starts to get fairly simple for black because I just go bishop d4, and my h-pawn's going to start running up the board, or at least, stutter stepping into the h1 square. And it's unstoppable. He can't stop bishop g1 without... Nope, he just can't do it. So now Kevin played rook d2, which is an interesting move to be sure, but it doesn't really amount to anything as the h-pawn will be queening. Otherwise white will have to give up the rook for it. So h2. And now rook takes d4, and there are a lot of discovered checks for white. However, because of the lack of coordination with the light squared bishop, black escapes fairly easily. So I played h1 equals queen. Anything else and people would have called me a chicken. And bishop d2 check. King takes f5. So none of the other checks really do anything. So, I mean, let's say bishop e5 check. I can actually play bishop e4 check, which is kind of a nice little in-between move. And that right there just stops all of white's checks. Well, let's see. After bishop d3, rook h2, king b3, queen d1, and it looks like I'm going to be picking up his light square bishop at the very least. Actually, this looks like a checkmate. And then, yeah, so queen d1, maybe he can go king a5. I mean, it's kind of useless to look at this because I'm up a queen, basically. So queen c1, king a4. Oh, now it says I can just capture this pawn, which is kind of funny. Yeah, because the dark square bishop is hanging, so that looks kind of hopeless. So after h1 queens, he doesn't really have too many good discoveries. None that I can see really do anything, and the computer agrees as well. So bishop d2 check, king takes f5, bishop d3 check, king e6, and now that my king has kind of reached that safe zone where white has no checks that don't sacrifice material, it should be fairly easy cleanup at this point. So Kevin played bishop c3, and now after rook h2, king b3, queen d1, king a3, queen c1, king b3. Another option is king a4, but bishop c6 is going to be leading to a checkmate fairly quickly here anyway. Let's just put these in really quick. Oh, sorry, that's not checkmate. Bit of a mouse slip over it. There we go. Now, so king a4, bishop c6 check, king back to b3, what else? Queen d1, bishop c2, and mouse slip again, and checkmate. So Kevin tried king b3, and then after bishop d1, it's going to be checkmate next move, but Kevin ended up running out of time here. He was fairly low on time for the last 10 moves or so. But bishop takes e2, mate is coming next, but basically I'm not sure I really deserve to win this game, simply based off my opening performance, but I mean, it's up to the player with the advantage to press for the win, and Kevin missed some really awesome opportunities to utterly annihilate my position, but instead opted for a more timid plan. But sometimes the bull just needs to be grabbed by the horns, and you just have to go for it. I believe he said after the game that he couldn't calculate it all the way, and you know, sometimes you just have to, you know, jump in without figuring out how deep the water is first. So I think it was Tall who said sacrifice first, then calculate. So yeah, I think a lot of sacrifices are actually done on principle, not necessarily on pure tactical prowess or pure calculation. I know a lot of mine are just based off more on instinct than actual calculations. So yeah, that's the game. Sorry I skipped this one. I think this video is probably pretty long, so sorry about that. Let me know what you guys think of the game. Sorry, Kevin, for swindling you out of that game. You should have won. Alright, I'll catch you guys next time.